That's all I can do. Hello, everybody. Hey, mic is on. Oh, be careful what you say when the mic is on. Hot mic. Hope all of you can hear me okay tonight. I have this mic right here underneath my tie. And that's all I can do when I'm wearing a sweater and my tie. So I don't have a lapel upon which I can place the mic. But anyway, if I go down like that, see, I have to keep... Elocution. I'm speaking out this way, addressing your audience, not looking down. We've had homiletics class and talking about all those things today. This is a class study on 1 Samuel. We took a break last week from our regular class schedule, and we had a period of singing. And tonight, the first Wednesday night of the year, we're going to get back into our study. I think our students have returned to us, and we're thankful for that. And hopefully everyone is settling down into their regular jobs or classes again. We are studying really the life of King David. And he's not king yet, but we're studying his life. And he's already been anointed king. He's going to be the king. God's already declared it. But the king at the moment is Saul. And at one time he's a key figure in the book of 1 Samuel. But then he becomes a secondary character. And that's part of his problem. He doesn't like playing a secondary role. It never would have happened had he remained faithful unto God. But he didn't. And so we're going to return tonight to 1 Samuel and study. Our study is going to begin in chapter 26. And we're not going to do a verse-by-verse study tonight. We're going to actually bring 1 Samuel to a close, if I possibly can do that. And I want to focus particularly tonight on a particular passage that we're going to find in 1 Samuel 26 as we close out the life of Saul. And as 1 Samuel closes, you're closing out the life of King Saul. And it's a sad ending for Saul. He says in 1 Samuel 26, and we will address that passage momentarily, but let's just go ahead and mention a statement made by him. I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. If ever there was an honest statement made about the life of Saul, he said it. And yet he's not the only one, is he, who's played the fool and erred exceedingly. Now Saul, I don't know of any character in the Old Testament, if not the entire Bible, that had more potential than did King Saul. But there are a lot of those who have a lot of potential, but they don't live up to it. And here is a man who started out strong, but he ends on a battlefield. He is going to be injured and then will ultimately take his own life. All right? So it's a sad sight when you look upon Saul as we get to the closing of the first book according to Samuel. We've heard about the Ziphites before, and these Ziphites are an interesting group because they keep an eye out for David. They want to stay in the favor of King Saul, and I don't know a lot about the Ziphites except to say this: they were tattlers. And the Ziphites wanted King Saul to know about David. Remember, a few chapters ago, it was the Ziphites who said something to King Saul, we've spotted David. Well, in 1 Samuel 26, they have reported to King Saul again and said, we've found David. And you've almost got the same thing happening here in 1 Samuel 26 as you did just a few chapters ago. You remember at the last time that David and Saul had some interaction, David could have killed him in the cave at Adullam. But David didn't do it. And he's not going to kill God's anointed. Even though he's hurt, he's disappointed, he doesn't understand, he's fearful of the king, and yet he will not take the life of God's anointed. So at the conclusion, when David informs Saul from a distance, hey, look what I've done. I could have taken your life. Oh, David, bless your heart. I'm sorry for what I've done. You could have taken my life, but you spared it. I'm sorry. I'm repenting of this. And then it's almost like in chapter 26, you have a repeat of the same thing. Now you're going to find this about David. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Although I'm not sure that David was fooled either time, because David is always on the run, realizing that he's got an enemy in Saul. He doesn't like it. It hurts him to the core, because Saul is somebody that he really wanted to respect. And there was a time when there was a close association between these two. And David brought great relief to King Saul, and David's helped King Saul. But the payback, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. That's what Saul wants to do. So, in chapter 26, having heard from the Ziphites where David is hiding out, he comes for him again. And once more, David is going to outfox Saul. Now I'll say this about Saul. Every time he goes on the hunt, he doesn't show a lot of credibility. He does not show that he's very smart, really. It seems that something always happens that puts himself in jeopardy instead of the one he's trying to track down and kill. And so once again in 1 Samuel 26, as Saul goes after David, David is able to turn things on Saul, because Saul always puts himself in a vulnerable position. He's not very careful. But remember, he's a foolish man. So he's not very careful at all. Now, once more we find that David is going to take an opportunity to show King Saul how that he could have taken his life, but he spared his life. Here again, something happens, and the Lord intervenes on this time. It seems on this particular occasion that Saul and his men are sleeping soundly, and I believe according to the text, the Lord had something to do that. They fell in this deep sleep. Can God put one in a deep sleep? Did Adam, didn't he? And Adam was in a deep sleep. I sometimes say when we study the opening chapters of Genesis, God not only performed the first surgery, but also provided the anesthetic, didn't he? All right. So here again, Saul is going to experience what Adam must have experienced, and that is fall into a deep, deep sleep. Now, when David comes to find out the location of Saul and his men, and I think this is rather interesting, he's standing in the midst of David's sleeping, or rather Saul's sleeping military unit. And there's always somebody on David's side that says, here's your opportunity. And David is told by Abishai, and Abishai, by the way, is Abner's brother, but Abner's with King Saul, Abishai's with David, and Abishai says, here's your moment. This is what you've wanted all along. Now you can take what's rightfully yours. What's he saying? Kill him. He's been led into your hand. And obviously Abishai and others think, hey, God's behind this. God's delivered him into your hand. But once again, David says, no, I'm not going to take the life of the king. God's what? Anointed. So, on this occasion, he just takes the spear and he takes a bottle of water or a canteen of water, and then after moving away a distance, he yells out to Abner. And he wants to know from Abner, what have you done? First of all, he expresses his respect that he has for Abner. Verse 15, he says, Abner, aren't you a valiant man? Well, when Abner dies, how will David remember him? As a prince and a great man that has fallen in Israel. So David has respect for Abner. Who is like thee in Israel? Wherefore then hast thou not kept thy Lord the king? For there came one of my people in to destroy the king thy Lord. And so David is saying to Abner, why aren't you doing a better job of protecting your king? You're committed to King Saul. He ought to have your protection, but he says you've not been doing a good job. Now, there's a focus just a moment on verse 10. And I want you to keep in mind something that's very, very important. When David was told by Abishai, here you go, take his life. Verse 9, David said, destroy him not. For who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And then I want you to notice verse 10. And keep this in mind because this is good admonition to you and me today. And it's this. As the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. Now think about that for a moment. That's David's perspective. The Lord will take care of it. Now that's what we need to learn from that verse, okay? We're probably not going to be, we won't be in this same situation that David finds himself, but don't we oftentimes want to take revenge and take something into our own hands? Sure. We want to handle it ourselves. And David says, look, if the Lord wants to smite him, He will. Somehow, some way, he's going to perish, isn't he? Because David knows that he's to be king, and it will happen in God's own time. And so, I think it's interesting to notice the patience of David, how he's willing to wait this out and operate according to God's timing. Brother Washington? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is what's happening to Saul right now, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's what's happening to Saul right now, isn't it? Absolutely. Yeah. Good point. Well, we notice that once again, after this episode takes place, guess what happens with Saul? I have sinned. When Saul hears that his own life has been spared, he can't help but once again say, I'm the one who's done wrong. I have sinned. And so he asks David to forgive him. He said, my soul has been precious in your eyes this day. He says, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly. And so here's what David says, well, look, I've got your spear. You send someone over here to fetch it. And then Saul said to David, verse 25, blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things and also shalt still prevail. So David went on his way and Saul returned to his place. So now I'm sure that David is walking away he's thinking, well, I'm sure glad this is over. I'm sure glad to know that Saul is my friend. I don't have anything else to worry about. No, he didn't buy into that at all, did he? I want to tell you something. When someone has behaved like Saul, all these, this erratic behavior all these many years, up and down, don't trust that person, right? And so, chapter 27, verse 1, David said in his heart, he said, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. In other words, he's going to keep on trying to kill me. Now, David does something that he shouldn't have done. That is, he flees into the land of the Philistines when God had already said, you stay in Judah and I'll take care of you. But sometimes we, again, take things into our own hands. And while we commend David for not lifting his hand against King Saul, then he himself is fearful for his life. And so he thinks it's best for him to go into Philistia. He seeks asylum by asking Achish, the king, for a place to live. He says, I'm not worthy of living in the same city as you because you're the king. And so Achish gave him Ziklag. And so that's where we find David. But let's spend just a moment talking about this passage in verse 21. I've played the fool and diverted exceedingly. As we think a little bit about Saul's life, as we bring his life to a conclusion in this particular study. Talk about playing foolish games. That's what he did. Now, I can remember some foolish games being played when I was just a boy. I don't think I played as many foolish games as my brother did. He's not here to defend himself. I remember him coming in one afternoon or into the evening, and I said, what have you been doing? He'd been with his buddies. They'd been shooting each other with BB guns. I said, don't you know you can put an eye out? Well, we were just shooting each other in the leg, you know. I'm glad you had your blue jeans on, you know. Not very, yeah, I was, yeah, old for my age. But I'm glad I wasn't doing that, you know. I remember growing up there in Alabama, you'd hear about people late at night doing something called drag racing. And sometimes people would get killed, wouldn't they? Doing things of that nature. Foolish games where people get hurt. Well, what happens when you follow the life of Saul, you find here is a man who, because of his foolish actions, he failed at life. He failed at life. Now, I don't really like to refer to life as being a game, because if we say that, we may not understand the significance of our lives here upon earth. But if we call it the game of life, we certainly want to win it, don't we? And when you think about it, Paul particularly must have been a sports enthusiast, because he was always talking about different kinds of games and used that as an analogy, comparing it to the Christian life, wasn't he? He talked about running a race. He talked about wrestling matches. He talked about boxing. And so I believe, living at the time Paul did, and the Olympic Games were prevalent, the Isthmus Games were well known during that first century in the Grecian Empire, not the Grecian Empire, but in the area of Greece. The Romans likewise were involved in all of that, but the Olympics beginning there in Greece. And so evidently Paul followed that closely, and he knew that others did too. He'd even talk about winning the crown of life. Well, what was the crown he's talking about in a physical sense? Well, if one would win a race, there would be perhaps a garland of flowers that would be placed upon the head, and that was your wreath, that was your crown, your reward for winning. So, yeah, something of that nature, yeah. So, we're talking about life, and sometimes the Bible compares it to like playing a game, and you want to win. Well, let's look at how Saul played the fool and how he erred exceedingly. First thing Saul did that brought him down was he began to disobey God. All right? Remember, the prophet Samuel was a chief advisor to King Saul, and you could not have had a better advisor at the moment than Saul. A leader is as good as the ones he chooses to put around him, all right, and to advise him. And in the multitude of counselors, the wise man says there is safety, there is security in that. You'll make good decisions when you have good counselors around you. Well, you would think that would be true, but that's the proverb, that's the general rule, but some people don't take that admonition, do they? Did Rehoboam have good counselors around him and the old men? He did, but he didn't want their counsel. And so when Saul rejected the prophet, he's rejecting whom? He's rejecting God, isn't he? And so, and he had a very, very big ego, though I believe at the same time he was very insecure. A lot of times you'll find that someone who seems to have a big ego will likewise be one of the most insecure people that you'll ever find. You look at the fellow who wants to always act like a bully and knocking everybody else around. Maybe he's even that way at home. And what happens is that man really is filled with a whole lot of insecurities. He's not sure of himself. People who are sure about who they are and are confident of themselves know how to treat others correctly. Well, Saul didn't know how to do that. But it's interesting how all this began. It began with compromise, didn't it? Because he was instructed, here's what you do when you take on the Amalekites, and that is you go and you destroy everything. But he thinks that he's doing the will of the Lord when he's really doing Saul's will. Remember, he says, well, I did exactly what the Lord told me to do. And Samuel said, well, what about the bleating of these sheep? Weren't they supposed to be? Oh, well, I kept back that because for sacrifices, you know. And there's a lot of people that operate that way in the religious realm, don't they? There are those who operate that way. They have a zeal for God. We read about that, but not in accordance to knowledge. There are those who give God lip service. In vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And so we find that his I'm sorry, when I look at my notes, that happens. On the when you consider the life of King Saul, he was one who began to disobey God. So when God says, I want you to destroy the Amalekites, 1 Samuel 15, he refused to do it. Now, I want us to consider something else, and that is, he let down his friends, didn't he? A man who loses his best friends is a man who plays the fool. Now I want to tell you something. Saul had a good friend in Samuel, but likewise he had a good friend in David. All right? So you think about it. Can we have friends of all ages? I don't know why we can't. And so here is Saul, perhaps in midlife, I guess, and there's this old prophet who wants to advise him. And then here is this young man, and he wants to serve his king. So let's just take those two examples. If you're midlife, I guess that's what I am. I may be over that now, but anyway, midlife would what? If I'm midlife, that means I'm going to live to 104. I don't know about that. I'm past it. But I do know that there are still some who are a few years older than I, and I respect these individuals. They are friends. And then there's some who are a good bit younger than I am, and I love them, respect them, they're friends. And I have also known situations to arise where I could learn from a younger person. And one of my classmates said he never will forget preaching in a meeting, and Brother Robert Taylor arrived for that meeting. And he and I both, as many of you, have great respect for the Bible knowledge of Brother Taylor. And Brother Taylor came out that night, and my friend said that Brother Taylor shook his hand. He says, he said, you said something there tonight I hadn't thought about. That's a good point. I appreciate that. My friend's like, I said something that Brother Taylor could use that he'd not thought about before. Well, Saul was in a unique position. If you take the fact that that there is Samuel and others that represent him, like his age, that would advise the king, and then young men like David who wanted to serve, and not only that, helped the king in a variety of ways. Look how he helped the king by defeating Goliath. Look how he helped the king by calming him, playing the harp. But a man loses his best friends when he plays the fool. If you go back to 1 Samuel 15, I believe it's verse 35. Yeah, that last verse. This is a sad verse. After that occurred with with Saul and the Amalekites, then you have Samuel. It says, no more coming to see Saul. Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. That is, he never saw him again. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he'd made Saul king over Israel. So, we have him losing a very good friend. Now, you think about it just for a moment. Where will you find your best friends? Here's what I was told. When I left for college many years ago, I was advised by my mother, and I think I received some good advice when she said, don't go to college and give up on the church. And among the various reasons, that's where you'll find your best friends. Okay? Now, I tried my best to heed that advice, and I've lived long enough to know it's true. Those are the people that will stick by me. Saul gave up the best counselors only to see his life fall apart. He was in disarray. We're going to talk about the prodigal this coming Sunday for our homecoming Sunday. That's fitting, don't you think? And there was a young man who had everything. He came to his senses, we know that. But let's look at what happened between the time he left his father and the pig pen. I'm confident that on the road to the far country, there were a lot of people who were going along with the prodigal. And good friends, so he thought. Because after all, he's paying the bills. Now look, if you can pay the bills, then you're going to have a lot of people latch on to you. And I said something today in my devotional post on Facebook. I said, you better guard your reputation. For some of us, that's all we have. Now, there are others who have a whole lot of money, don't they? And it seems like that, at least for the moment, temporarily, they can risk their own reputations because people don't care. They like to get close to those who have what? Money. Money. Now, that old boy had a lot of money, but then the money ran out. You see, in his father's house, his father knew how to make more money. Okay? He was a businessman. It didn't just happen that he had money. I think he made money, and he kept on making it. But his boy that ran away didn't understand that. All he knew was give me and spend it. And I heard something not long ago along that same line where there's a family that I know back in Chattanooga area, close to home, and family connected to mine. And I said, well, you know, that man who died, I think he left his children a pretty good inheritance. Oh, he did. And this person they knew all the dollar amounts and everything. It was said that one had this many, like let's say 3 children and left $300,000 apiece, and one no doubt put hers in savings and invested it properly, things of that nature. There was a son who did the same. I said, well, what about this other daughter? Oh, it's just gone. It's gone. I mean, she spent it on some just frivolous items. Went and had her face stretched, and it came back again, you know. That cost about $100,000. Didn't help her, still ugly. No, I don't know. That's not right. But I'm just saying, It wasn't worth that much, I'll tell you that. All right? Now, these friends of the prodigal, for example, they're as long as somebody's paying the bill. But then notice what happened. He lost his friends. We know that because he's in the pig pen. And they weren't there. They didn't care about following him. They didn't care about following him anymore. Here is Saul losing the very best that he had. Even many of those who serve him don't honor him, do they? We already know that. They don't respect him. Didn't some even try to plead with him? What's David done to except good? So they're only obeying the king because they have to do it. He's the king, and they don't want to get in trouble otherwise. But a man loses his best friends when he plays the fool. That's what happened to Saul. He lost the friendship of Samuel. He lost the friendship of David. I'll tell you what, with the exception of perhaps Uriah, I'd want to be a friend with David, don't you? Wouldn't you? David, for most of his life, was a good man, and look at the good he did for King Saul. Even when Nabal, he was going to come after Nabal, David shows his tender heart because Nabal's wife, who's completely different from old curlish King Nabal, she pleads on his behalf, and David listened. So he loses Samuel, he loses David, and he loses that relationship that he has with Jonathan. And then we're going to see what happens to poor old Jonathan. He lost the loyalty of Jonathan. I mean, look, David's victories would have been, they were Saul's victories. Jonathan's victories, Saul's victories. Samuel's victories, Saul's. And yet Saul would not let it happen. He betrayed his friends. But before we close tonight, there's something else that he did that really is amazing, and that is he even sunk to the depths of relying upon witchcraft to try to reach the prophet of God. So it is that whenever you go down this course of disobedience to God and losing your relationship with God, you start looking into things that are even cultic in nature to try to find your answers. So here is Saul having at one time doing what? Doing away with those who engaged in witchcraft and idolatry. Now seeking out a woman in Endor, trying to get information from the prophet as to what to do. Mm-hmm. And could not handle it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you're right. And we find I think the bottom is when you find him going into that witch of Endor, when he sought after her and he puts on these clothes where he couldn't be recognized. And she found out who he was, because she knew that wasn't an apparition coming up. That was a real man. Who was it? God allowed Samuel. Samuel. I love what Samuel says. Why have you called me up? Tonight, if somebody from the other side that we love is resting over in paradise, and they all of a sudden, through the power of God, are able to come back here, and we say, well, we called for you. Why'd you do that? All right? Why'd you bring me back here? And so that was Samuel's attitude. And Samuel says, well, God's not going to, He doesn't have a word for you except this: you're going to die. That's what, and then this witch of Endor, she finds out who he is, and she trembles, and Saul is trembling as he finds out what's going to happen to him, and who's going to defeat him? Those old Philistines. So as the chapter closes, as the final chapters close, you find David hiding out in Philistia, and you find Saul fighting the Philistines, and you find that just as God has said, he's going to die. Not only that, his faithful to God, son, Jonathan, dies with him. But in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan, and they slew the other sons of Saul. Isn't that sad when a child has to pay for the deeds of a father? Even these innocent like Jonathan died right along with him. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith. Let these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. Don't let them kill me. Don't let them take my life. But his armor-bearer wouldn't do it. He was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword. He fell on it. And then when his armor-bearer saw that he was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So that's the end of King Saul, the one who's best described in my judgment by his own words. I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. Okay? Thank you.